Hi everyone, Rachael here, and welcome to this brand new episode of the Ditch the Diet podcast. If you're a brand new listener to the show, this is the Ditch the Diet podcast, and this podcast is for you if you are absolutely sick and tired of yo-yo dieting and you're looking for some fresh, new, evidence-based information about nutrition, health, and everything food, exercise, and healthy lifestyle related. You are in the right place if that sounds like you. And welcome to the Ditch the Diet podcast. It's great to have you here. If you are a long-term listener and you're coming back to listen to a new episode, thank you for coming back. I'm guessing that means you like the podcast. So if you could do me a little favour before you go, just scroll down on Apple Podcasts if that's where you're listening and leave me a 5-star review for the podcast. It means a lot. So in today's episode, I'm talking to paediatric dietitian Lucy Upton, and it's an episode that I've been wanting to record for a while. It was just waiting for the right person to speak to, and I would say I've definitely found her. So in this episode, we're talking about childhood nutrition, in particular, how to get healthy as a family. So how to start and maintain a healthy eating routine as a family. And the second half of this episode, we're talking about fussy eating in children. Now, I know a lot of you out there are parents, aunties, uncles, sisters, brothers who may have experienced or are currently experiencing fussy eating with children, and it can be extremely frustrating not knowing what to do, feeling guilty, and just stressed out with the whole thing. So hopefully we'll shed some light on that in this episode and give you a bit of reassurance that we're sure you're doing everything that you can. Lucy also gives us some great tips on healthy eating for the whole family, as well as some tips on how to deal with fussy eating in young kids. So hope you enjoy this episode, and I'll be back at the end to tell you how you can find out more about what Lucy does. Enjoy. So a very warm welcome to Lucy to the podcast today. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for taking the time out of your super busy schedule.
You're very welcome. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, and it's also exciting to talk about a topic that I get asked about all the time at Ditch the Diet, and the people that listen to the podcast and the members of Ditch the Diet, we all have family, whether that be, children, husbands, wives, mums, dads, sisters, nieces, nephews, and I think I get asked almost every day a question about sort of children or
kids
family,
nutrition,
nutrition, that kind of thing. That's not my forte. So before we get started, just let's have a little introduction. So who are you? What do you do?
So my name is Lucy Upton. I have a very long title for my NHS job. So I'm a specialist paediatric dietitian. I actually work full-time at a big children's hospital in Birmingham. But then I'm a sucker for working hard, so I actually do a few other things on top of that. So I am a trained feeding therapist, and I work in an absolutely wonderful team of an occupational therapist and speech and language therapist and psychology if we need it, doing particularly children with quite challenging feeding difficulties, tube weaning, ARFID, that's been in the news quite a lot, so the avoidant restricted food intake disorder. So we deal with more sort of very complex side of feeding that really does need an MDT. And then on top of that, I do lots of freelance work, I do media work, and I do some public health work for infant and toddler forums. So yes, many hats of child nutrition I wear.
When was the last time you sat down?
Well, now, to record it, actually, I'm quite comfortable.
It sounds like you've got lots on.
I do.
So we chatted a bit before we had started recording, but it would be great to find out more about sort of what got you interested in dietetics in the first place, I suppose, and then also what made you more interested in sort of working with children.
I mean, we get this question a lot, and it's really funny because I always ask my students this question. You inherently go to, why are you a dietitian? I think a combination of three things that I'm sure lots of dietitians or nutritionists can empathise with too. So one is probably a love of food and an interest on how nutrition has, impacts the body and the mind, and a whole host of genetics, a whole host of things. But two, I quite like food, and I'm a real big foodie. I like cooking. Some of my earliest memories are of being in the kitchen with my mum, and I think that probably impacts on why I've kind of steered towards paediatric dietetics. And the third thing really is that I really like working with people. So I think when you combine those three loves, really, I kind of was like, yes, I'm going to go and be a dietitian. I was one of those people who actually really knew what they wanted to do when they went to university. And then I went to university and we did lots of adult work at university because there aren't that many paediatric centres really across the UK. And we didn't have a huge amount of peds experience. So my first job that I did was for a sort of specialist mental health charity. It was actually private, which is quite funny because everyone was like, oh my gosh, your first job isn't for the NHS. And so I ended up working there and took on some adolescent and child work in quite a specialist mental health setting. And I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, nutrition across the lifespan and the influence that getting nutrition or eating habits or supporting families in these really early years, so anywhere, like I was saying to you earlier, anywhere picking up from a premature baby all the way through to 16, you can have such an impact on a child's health and their well-being and a family's health and well-being together. And there's lots of little niggly bits that I really like about peds. Managing children is not the same as managing adults. Their nutritional requirements at each stage of their life are very different, and you have to think about a lot of things. And I suppose the science geek in me really enjoys that bit too. So, and I like kids. It's fair to say I like working with children.
Yeah, that's great. And sort of what's your day-to-day practice look like? What sort of cases and what types of patients do you deal with?
I don't think 2 days are the same. I was actually thinking about this earlier when I was at work. I was like, oh, what is my day like? So my busy NHS job will be a mixture of outpatient clinics, so where patients and their families come in and they come to see me and to look at a particular issue that often a doctor or health visitor or someone has referred them for. So that might be food allergies, multiple food allergies, which everyone will know I do quite a lot of, any growth concerns, feeding difficulties, but then I do, the specialist nutrition that I think people often forget about with dietitians are things like complex tube feeds or parenteral nutrition, so that's IV nutrition, and then so I'll see all those sort of things as an outpatient, but we'd also be managing an inpatient caseload, so that will be children who are quite acutely unwell for whatever reason, who often need a dietitian on the ward. And I have to say, in big paediatric centres, doctors generally, I would say, really, really enjoy the company of a dietitian in their team, because no matter medically what is going on with that child, it's absolutely essential that their nutrition is given some airtime, because we still need to make sure that they're growing, that their brain is developing, that they're getting all the nutrition that they need, so that they don't suffer any further sort of health consequences. So yeah, a bit of a mix of in and outpatient caseload. And then on top of that, when I'm not in my NHS job, as I said, I do feeding clinic within a big team, which I love, because anybody who knows me knows I'm a huge advocate for multidisciplinary working. So feeding can often be more complex than just a dietitian's role. Sometimes you need speech and language therapy. Often you'll need a psychologist or an occupational therapist. So I feel very, very fortunate to be able to work in that team. And then just keeping myself up to date with lots of public health things that are going on for kids in the UK and sort of across the world. Actually, there was some UNICEF stuff that came out recently, so that I can apply that to lots of the work that I do with infant and toddler form, and that focuses a lot on early years nutrition, so actually preconception, pregnancy, and all the way through to sort of the toddler years, because that's a really key area that's getting a lot of media attention at the moment.
Yeah, I noticed that actually. As a parent, I think I could go on and on for ages about this, but I think as a parent you often are bombarded with so much information about what's healthy and what's not healthy, and you kind of get overwhelmed with it for yourself, let alone your children, and it must be quite a worry to think, what should I be feeding my kids? Like, one person says this is the healthiest diet, one person says this, and I'm supposed to be getting them 5 fruit and veg a day, and they won't even entertain one.
Yeah.
And there's just it seems to be such a minefield at the moment. And what would you say are the biggest challenges faced by parents these days when it comes to sort of balancing a healthy sort of meal for your kids or for your whole family, I suppose?
And again, we touched on this just before we sort of started recording. I completely agree that the nutrition noise out there is not just isolated to, diet culture or any sort of adult nutrition topics. I think actually it's a complete and utter minefield as a parent, and feeding your child gets so much focus and is the focus of so much worry and guilt and anxiety, and you just want somebody sometimes to tell you, what do I need to do for my child? What should I feed them? How much should I feed them? When should I feed them? And much like it, we love the phrase as dietitians, well, it depends, because it does, it's real, it depends. It's child focused, it's family focused. Your guidance might be slightly different for each sort of family setup and child and their needs. But I think people generally, certainly I would say over the last 5 years, are losing their confidence. I think, what do I start with weaning? Do I do this? Do I put allergenic foods in early? Do I not? How many meals a day should they have? Is this food healthy or is it not? I don't know. And I think that's then mixed up with the fact that it isn't just that parents don't know how to interpret those messages that everybody is giving them from the wide mass of people giving them information. And I mean, let's not forget that nutrition information doesn't just come from nutrition professionals. It comes from the other health professionals involved in children's care, so GPs, health visitors, midwives, but then it also comes from the media, it comes from advertising, it comes from manufacturing companies, it comes from Instagram. And I just think it's a complete and utter haze for parents to be finding their way through. And then on top of that, I think you've got a food environment that is very challenging to be bringing children up with now. We don't have, we actually have a bit of a paradigm really between the UNICEF actually brought out something called the State of the World's Children, and it was talking a lot about feeding children and how lots of children in the world are not a healthy weight. They're either underweight or they're overweight, and why is this? And actually talks a lot about the children highly influenced by their environment. And we see things like lots of the poorest areas in the country are really fast food hotspots. Children are disproportionately exposed to things like takeaways and high-calorie foods and low-nutrient meals. Whereas we do also know increasingly, and this is coming out in the media, that there's lots of children that are don't have enough food and are going to bed hungry. And we're seeing a rise in food banks and families really struggling to feed their children, and sometimes often, negating feeding themselves and putting their children first. So I think there's that, there's income, but there's also things like, if we go all the way back to education, and I did a really lovely teaching session in a school up in Scotland about a month ago, who were wonderful because they brought healthy eating and education about food throughout their curriculum from years 7 upwards. I suppose that's UK system, isn't it? Year 7 upwards. I can't remember what it was up there in Scotland, but
primary and we don't,
it
would be.
Primary and secondary. But we're, increasingly, are we teaching children about food? Are we teaching children to cook? I mean, I remember doing like food technology, like home ec, but increasingly you don't see that in schools anymore. So we're not even equipping the kids, parents and families with skills about how to put a healthy meal together, how to cook. And then, I'm layering this now. And on top of that, we've got food manufacturing, advertising that's really misleading for families. And that goes as early as weaning. I have this real vendetta against baby products and food products at weaning that are advertised as, give this to your child, it's peas, it's broccoli, and it's apple. And then you look on the back and it's like 80% apple puree, and you just think, that's not what it says on the tin, actually. And it's a bit naughty. And so I just think, it's no wonder people are looking for information, but it's identifying the right sources and something that's credible and evidence-based, and that is difficult. And then the other thing, sorry, I told you I'd chat loads. The other thing is families. Families always have their own interpretation and their own idea about what healthy is, cultural and religious differences in that. I work with lots of families in Birmingham who parents come to me and they say, I know I should be doing what you're saying. Oh yeah, but granny and granddad, when they're around their house, and I'm not placing blame on grandparents here, aunties, uncles, siblings, cousins, whatever. The dynamic in every family has a very slightly different dynamic, and I think suppose it's another reason I love my job. It's kind of working out what that is and how you best support that family to make some changes that will optimise the child's health. But, you know, inherently it's about optimising a family's health, because I would never recommend that changes that you're putting forward for a child are pinned on the child only. Often it needs to be a little bit more family-based, sort of holistic approach. Let's look at the whole thing rather than just the child.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned something else there that I thought was quite important as well, is that I think a lot of the time parents have a feeling of guilt for maybe not doing something the way that it's, you know, states in the books, or, you know, you see lots of things around social media of, you know, my child is being weaned on all of this, and look at my child, they eat all of this, and it's like, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, and it's just like, but I can't get my child to even sit down and like want to eat food, let alone, you know, all this fancy
have
stuff.
Have avocado and goji berries for breakfast.
Yeah,
I know. And I think there's that bombardment as well, as you were saying, you know, with look at what my child's doing. You're seeing that lovely highlight reel doesn't just apply to people and things and you know, everything else that you see on social media, but it's you sit down after you've tried to feed your child for 2 hours this evening and you see bamboo plates on Instagram full of fabulous food. And I have to say, you know, one of the things I always say to my families is that healthy eating doesn't have to be as complicated as it seems. You know, there's this, healthy diets mean different things for different people, and there are lots of ways of interpreting it. And whilst, yes, we should be looking at getting in some key food groups, we should be looking to get in variety, it's perfectly acceptable to have a meal of fish fingers, mashed potato and peas that's taken a grand total of 15 minutes to put together. You are still giving your child a balance of each food groups. You are still giving them a varied meal. You are still giving them a nourishing meal, and they are fed, you know, and I think sometimes parents, if I had my magic wand for one thing and one thing only, and I'd be really interested to see what other dietitians would say in different circumstances to this, actually, mine would be to magically alleviate all the pressure that parents put on themselves, because as we'll probably talk about later, we talk about fuss eating, that can often sort of compound some further issues around children's feeding. But also I think that there's so much else to think about all of the time with a child, that actually uncomplicating it for them and taking that pressure off is really, really important. Because yes, food and nutrition is essential, but it doesn't have to be complicated.
Absolutely. And let's talk about how to uncomplicate it then, just for the listeners. So what sort of advice or tips could you give parents, like busy families, to start sort of improving their health through healthy eating?
So, as I say, my rule absolute number one would be that if families are going to do that, they need to consider it a family-based change rather than a child-based change. So it's let's take the pressure off the child. It's not about this child eating, it's about our families eating and our families' attitude towards food. I completely appreciate, as you know, I don't have a family yet, but as a busy professional, I barely even find time to feed myself sometimes, let alone a brood of wonderful children. So I sometimes just think, how do these super parents do all of this and both have full-time jobs? So I would say key things. Consider it from a family-based approach. So always think about how we're going to do this for everybody. I'm not going to make 6 different meals for everyone. So make one meal, and this includes in coming to fussy eating as well, and we'll get onto that, which is much more cost-effective, much more timely, and means that you, as you say, do not have 65 oven dishes in and 3 pounds on the hob. I generally then say, and I know everybody talks about doing this, and actually it's quite hard, there is a lot to be said about investing some time in batch cooking and a little bit of preparation. And I'm not, you know, this sounds like I'm going meal prep Sundays. I'm not. It doesn't matter what day it is or time of the week it is or when it is. But actually, even if it's just getting a few basic things together, like making a big old dish of mince and tomatoes and vegetables that you can then add kidney beans and some chili to for a chili for one, or you can add you know, peas and some spices in to make keema. You know, think about ways that you can have a one pot that can be adapted a few ways and that can be frozen. I think the other thing everybody forgets about is, and I know, again, dietitians love to bang on about this, but I think it's because everybody thinks that fresh food and healthy eating has to be from the fresh aisles, from the fridge, from the fruit and vegetable section in the supermarket. And no, it absolutely doesn't. Frozen fruit and veg, great. They're in the freezer, you whack them in the microwave, you whack it in a pan, and it is done in 10 or 15 minutes. Fruit, from a nutrient point of view, they are still just as great, and they're super easy. And nowadays, you can get all sorts of mixed bags of this. You can even buy, I found the other day, and I used actually just to make a meal, you can buy bags of mixed rice and vegetables all together, and you just got to whack it in a pan. I think it's trying to find hacks that make it a little bit easier. Yeah. I'm a big advocate of a menu plan, but that's because I think sometimes, even if it's a loose guide in your head, we'll have something fish related on Monday, and we'll have something with, chickpeas and beans on Tuesday, and the rice I've got to use up or whatever. Having some kind of meal plan can be really, really helpful to keep sane, but also to prevent the thing that we all do, and, I am just as guilty of this, is, I don't have anything in the fridge, I'm going to go to the supermarket. Go to the supermarket hungry, and you either pick up probably something quick and convenient, or you pick up lots of random stuff, and you get home and you realise you can't even make a meal out of it, and you're like, oh, this didn't quite end up well, and you end up just having, beans on toast, which is still perfectly acceptable dinner. But and I have, what I tend to do is, I've made like an easy recipes folder in like my phone, because lots of people use their phone and their tablets nowadays, and if you see quick and easy recipes that are just go-tos, save them and keep them in a folder in your phone. You can have, worst case, if you're standing in the supermarket, you can have a quick scroll through and go, oh yeah, we'll do frittata, or we'll do, 5-ingredient curry or whatever. That comes to sort of uncomplicating it as well. Slow cooker, one pan dishes, keeping it really, really simple. As I say, it doesn't have to be complicated. There don't have to be multiple ingredients. I would also say I'm a massive, massive advocate of trying to avoid your waste. We all know that there's those days when you're like, oh my gosh, I've got 6 wrinkly carrots and an onion, and I'm not quite sure what this was. That probably does need to go in the bin. And in those days, can that be made into soup? I am a sucker for, this is all wrinkly, I'm going to roast it. I just roast it all. I cut it all up and I roast it all, and then you can mix that in various different things, in sauces or in couscous or whatever it might be. So it's menu planning. It's doing a little bit of batch cooking and preparation wherever you can. Be prepared, which can be difficult. I think for some families, and it can be really, really helpful. I've got loads that advocate shopping online, particularly if they find it difficult as they go around a supermarket, and or you have the child who's put the 15 Freddos in and out of the basket 6 times. You're like, no, there it goes. Because yes, you can buy Freddos, but you can buy 1 pack, not 15, and you can control what's coming home with you. And then when you want to do it again, most of the online shops now will just save it in your favourites, and you can use the same sorts of things again and again, and you create that sort of stock cupboard of, these are my go-to essentials, wherever they can. And on that topic about Freddos, this is me. There are many other chocolates available other than Freddos, just to say. Other chocolates are available. But I would say, do consider for your kids, particularly if they are the age where they will start to help themselves from the cupboards, and that grazing and that snacking becomes a little bit more of a routine that you might want to shift. Really think about what you have available, how much of it you have available, and actually, is picking a healthy option at home easy or not? Is there a bowl of fruit? Is there some dried fruit in the cupboard? Do you have some yogurt? Do you have, some crackers and some hummus or some avocado or some cheese spread? Or do you have these things that are easy and accessible as going in the cupboard and picking up a bag of crisps? Because it's looking at, am I controlling my child's food environment a little bit for them? Lead by example. This is why I would say, children inherently do want to do what their parents and all siblings are doing. So it would be very difficult to say to one child in a family, say who you're perhaps struggling with, no, you can't have the bag of crisps, but then everybody else sits there and has one. That just doesn't work. And I've seen families try to do it, and that kind of goes back to my main point, which is, if you're going to do it, then you do it as a family, and you accept it's a journey that you're all on. But don't do everything at once either. sort of goal planning and menu planning and thinking about this with your kids is try and just do one of those things a week to begin with. Because if you give yourself, and we all do this massive list of things that you want to do, if you try to do everything that I just said in week one, I suppose it's much like dealing with lots of the clients that you see as well, Rachel. It's just not going to happen.
No. One thing at a time.
one thing at a time. Yeah. One thing at a time. You know, absolutely.
And I'm going to get onto the subject of fussy eating now, because I find this, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about this, because I've experienced it loads, like, throughout my life with various kids that I've come into contact with, and with my nieces as well, and my friends' kids, and I see it all the time. So it's
it is very common. It is very common, and you know, and it is everybody. I think everybody thinks dietitians must have perfect diets as well. And I'll tell you a story. My mum swears that I basically lived off cheese sandwiches between the ages of 2 and 5, to the point where I ended up in a paediatrician's office, and actually she was this to me now, and they basically told me not to worry because you were growing fine. And you know what, that is still something now. Well, I'm in my 30s now, so, and I still hear this now. And I think this is something that I think really can hit a sore spot with families, is they might be like, yes, I know my child's growing fine, but that's because all they're eating is toast. And I'm giving them lots of toast. So, but that doesn't help, does it? Being told, whilst it can be very reassuring because growth can be a concern, it doesn't help with what you do, does it?
No.
You're like, okay, that's great. That's really good that they're growing well. What do I do now?
Yeah.
You know, and that's what people want. I'm really conscious about trying to give families answers rather than, oh, your child is a fussy eater because, you know, developmentally that's very normal at 2. Oh, and, you know, lots of the kids I see, they were tube fed early on in their, you know, or they've got multiple food allergies and all of those sorts of things. And actually it's trying to provide some practical answers and steps forward to take one at a time, often, to do that. And I'm kind of sorry, I'm losing my voice here a little bit.
Sorry, too much talking today. I think, with, you know, the tips and things that you gave about healthy eating for the whole family were absolutely amazing. But what if you are faced with a fussy eater? So those of us with kids will know that, you know, there's often that daily dinner drama. So is there any reason why some kids become fussy eaters and others not? Or should we all expect to go through some sort of experience of this at some stage?
So it is very, very normal, anywhere between about 18 months of age, 2 years, and that is because a child's development at that stage will kick in this food neophobia, and this is probably a massive throwback to those years when a toddler who's suddenly waddling around everywhere and exploring the world and taking absolutely everything in needs to be a bit careful that they don't put everything that they see in their mouth in their mouth. Does that make sense? So, this looks nice, I'll put this in. And it's a way of keeping themselves safe. And so often what you'll see with kids is you'll be like, hold on a minute, they were eating that last week and they don't eat that anymore. Or they'll insist that they won't eat it unless it looks a certain way. You know, that's when families start to see, oh, my kid won't eat this biscuit if it's broken in half. Or if the toast is too burnt or brown. And you just think, how do you even know the difference? And these kids at that age are really astutely aware of even small differences to food. And actually, you know, sometimes that can be why we end up with this bland and tanned diet that lots of people will probably relate to. And you're like, oh, yeah, they'll eat toast, they'll eat fish fingers, they'll eat chips, they'll eat everything. You know, it's beige and it's a certain shape or colour or texture. And actually... well, that's because you know what you're getting every time, don't you? That's a fish finger, and that's what that's going to do. Whereas with things like fruit and veg, they can be the really notorious ones with fussy eating, is that you don't really get 2, let's say, apples that are exactly the same, do you?
No, exactly.
You know, and they are much less predictable. So there is an element of that, but then there are other things that can exacerbate fussy eating, for want of a better term. So... we see things like children with food allergies tend to see a lot more in the way of feeding difficulties. Now, that's not surprising if they've had a particularly challenging start with consuming certain foods and not feeling very well afterwards. You know, children at that age are just going to learn by association, aren't they? Oh, well, I ate anything that looks like milk or yogurt or cheese, I've got tummy ache an hour later, and I'm covered in an itchy rash or whatever it might be. Children who've had very, very troublesome reflux, really common to see feeding difficulties there. I see that probably weekly. For some kids, it can be a real trigger. So there might be some fussy eating elements, but then they've had an episode of choking, or they've had D&V, gastroenteritis, they've been poorly, and that seems to set them back, and you never quite get them back to their diet that they had pre-illness. I see that quite a lot. There is there's some quite good evidence actually that it can be a little bit more common in children who didn't get to manage a wide range of tastes and textures during the weaning period. So that is important. So that's why this early life nutrition is coming in. It's very important to expose children to as much as you can in terms of variety during complementary feeding, weaning. But yeah, and then on top of that, you see a huge number of other factors which can, I probably am a little bit skewed another way because I see really complex feeding. I see children who might have sensory sensitivities, so you'll find kids really sensitive to smell or taste, or and they struggle with the sensory task that is eating. And I think the key thing really is, yes, developmentally, it's a really normal behaviour, and I would expect most families to have at least a snapshot of it in their toddler at some point. You're lucky if you get it through and your child doesn't have any element of fussy eating or food refusal. The key thing really is that when it goes beyond that, that's a different management strategy to just fussy eating or picky eating as a child. And it can, I think, as I said, often people are just like, oh, it's just fussy eating, they'll grow out of it. And I hear it a lot of, oh, they just told me to starve them and they'll eat eventually, and all of those things. And actually, the feedback you always get from parents is those things are not helpful to me. And actually, I don't know many parents that are completely willing to send their child to bed 3 days in a row with an empty tummy, understandably. So I think it's kind of troubleshooting what you do in those scenarios, really, with families and what to do. And generally, just to reassure most families out there, most children have fussy eaters. It doesn't impact on their growth. It doesn't impact on their nutrition then or even later on in their life for the majority of children. And yes, it is a phase that will pass, and I promise there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. And as I say, the caveat to that is the small group of children that go on to have much more problem feeding, which we can always chat about at the end and to look out for some red flags for that. In case, and I suppose it's looking at then, it's not parents' fault. It's nobody's fault. What are we going to do about it? Going forward. But
you hear lots of different advice, don't you? I think over the years, some of the advice that I've heard is, you should force them to eat it, or it's, the classic, if you don't eat vegetables, you're not getting dessert, or if you don't eat that, there's nothing else. You're going to go to bed starving.
A little bit of threatening behaviour, and then a little bit of bribery, and then the next day we'll try a different tactic. Look, your dog, the dog's eating it, you should eat it. And oh God, I've probably heard over 10 years of peds, everything under the sun, every possible way. And actually, I empathise with these families because lots get to desperation point. They start, they do start feeding their children, they do start perhaps forcing things in, and actually that's not really the approach that we would be taking. But I wouldn't be a good health professional if I didn't understand why they got there. It's not because they want to be there, it's because progressively they felt like they've got no other choice.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can also start to worry a little bit. One of the members of Ditch the Diet says, she worries herself sick about the fact that is she not feeding her child, they won't eat fruits and vegetables, and she's worried about the nutrient intake that they're getting. And I know I've got a couple of questions from listeners, that I was going to go through as well that might cover that, but it's a minefield. Should we be worrying? Should we be worrying ourselves sick that they're not getting their 5 a day at the age of 2.5, if they're fussy eaters?
Yeah, really, as I kind of just touched on, they will probably get there anyway. The key thing to remember is that they're not going to get there tomorrow, and they're probably not going to get there next week. And it's about, I say to families, it's about accepting that you're going to be on a bit of a journey now, and it isn't just going to be mended. It's not like any other aspect of, give a probably a crude example. Your child has reflux, we'll give this medication and it will go away, or it'll be better managed. And I always say, you don't expect the journey that a child takes, for example, to learn to walk, they don't wake up one morning and walk. They roll over onto their tummies, they start commando crawling, then they're crawling, then they're pulling themselves up on things, but they're still very wobbly. And actually, the same with learning to talk or learning to write. You don't ever expect your child to do that straight away. But with eating, we're like, well, why aren't you doing it now? Why won't you eat this for me? And actually, it's totally okay to worry, and it's totally okay to be anxious, because you're a parent. Of course you're going to, of course you're going to be anxious about it. And the other thing with feeding is you can't escape it, Oh, and it's another meal snack time coming around every 2 to 3 hours, every day. Yeah. For the foreseeable future. Do you know what I mean? You can't be like, I'll just have a day off from this, because it's quite stressful.
Yeah.
You can't. And so it builds, it layers. There's this layering upon layer of worry and stress, and then they get every cold and flu bug going at nursery or school, and then they don't eat even more, and you're just at your wit's end. So acknowledge the feeling that you're feeling worried and that you are feeling stressed. Try and keep that to yourself, and we'll talk about that with fussy eating. It's really important to try and, put a bit of a game face on when you're managing a child who's a fussy eater, but you're going to feel worried, and that's okay. But from you say, and so as you say, some of your readers and some of the lovely men and women that you work with, they're worried: is this going to affect my child's nutrition? Now, if you are very worried, you need to go and see your GP and probably ask to have a conversation with someone like a paediatric dietitian. But I realise there's not many of us really in the grand scheme of things. But the two key factors, growth-wise, is your child growing okay? And that's looking at centile charts, making it sure that you're with somebody who knows how to interpret a centile chart too, because I get lots of questions about that. And here's me going off on a tangent now, just to say lower centiles and higher centiles are not how you interpret centile charts. I have lots of families who come to me and say, shouldn't my child be on the 50th centile? Shouldn't they be growing on the 50th centile? 50th is average, isn't that what they should be doing? Those centile charts show us how lots of children grow, but how lots of children grow healthily. So, the 50th centile just tells us that, for example, for a weight, that there would be 49 children less heavy and 50 heavier. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And that's a class, that's like lining up, it's a standard deviation. It's if you lined up a class of kids in height order, there would be the smallest, there would be the tallest, and there would be everybody in between. It doesn't mean any of them are inherently necessarily unhealthy. It's just that's how they're growing. So the key thing is make sure you've got someone who knows how to interpret that growth chart well. Key flags for children who aren't growing are generally children who, for their weight, have fallen across centiles. So they might have been on the 50th centile and they've fallen perhaps 2 centiles down. Or if there was quite a big gap between the centile that they fell on for their height. So say they fell on the 50th centile for their height, but they fell on the 0.4th centile for their weight. There is quite a big difference between those centiles. Normally we'd say roughly a 2 centile range either side. So it's about understanding people that can interpret that for you. But the other thing I would discourage families to do is persistently weigh their children. Because you see those minor fluctuations. You see the one on the day when they haven't been for a poo yet. You see the one, kids don't have the stores that we do. So after, if they've been unwell, they drop weight very quickly, remarkably quickly, and that's because they don't have the scope for storing, like carbohydrate, glycogen. They don't have big livers, they don't have big muscle stores like we do as fully grown adults. So yes, they do lose weight quite quickly, but they also rebound beautifully most of the time. So growth is the number one thing. And two, I think from a nutritional perspective, and whilst I don't want to give blanket advice to everybody because it's very individual, kids, toddlers anyway, so supplementation that they should be having is vitamins A, C and D until they are 5 years of school age. So that's across whether it's winter or summer, they should be having those daily. So that can be like Healthy Start drops or Abidec or something equivalent. And if you are really worried that your child's, oh my gosh, Lucy, they are not eating a single fruit or vegetable, then yes, maybe they do need a broader spectrum, so like an A to Z or something that says A to Z or complete, an age-appropriate multivitamin. And that should be good enough to kind of top them up if needed. until their diet improves, and they are widely available now. The key thing I would say is don't double up on multivitamins. There's absolutely no need. And actually for things like fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, it can be detrimental if you give too much of something. There's no need. Just a good multivitamin if they're cutting out big food groups. But otherwise, sometimes for sanity, I would say to families, they'll say, Lucy, they don't eat any... They eat no fruit or vegetables and they eat no meat or protein-rich food. And actually what we do is we sit down and we go through everything that they tend to eat together, and we correspond it to the food group. So, okay, so they'll have bread. Okay, that's carbohydrate. Oh, and they'll have baked beans. Okay, that's protein-rich food, and that's iron fortified. That's good. And they'll have raisins. Oh, well, actually, that's a fruit or vegetable. Oh, and they will have peas. Okay, that's a vegetable. And they really like, cheese and these particular yogurts, and all of a sudden you start to populate, they do have foods from all of the food groups, and whilst there isn't 25 foods in each food group yet, actually they are getting some of those. So I think sometimes a little sense check can be helpful, and I'm an advocate sometimes of writing it down, because what we can do as parents and carers is divert to just giving a child the food that they like, because we know that they will eat it and we want them to eat. Yeah. Do you know what? I'm just going to give them Weetabix for the third time again today because I need my child. I don't want my child to go to bed hungry. Yeah. And actually what we risk doing, particularly in that toddler early year stage, is if you give a child persistently the same food over and over and over again, what we tend to see is this term that some people may or may not have heard of is a food jag. And that is, you wake them up the next morning and they completely reject the Weetabix, and then the pit of your stomach is falling through the floor because you just think, hold on a minute, I've just lost one of their safe foods. Why are they not eating it? They ate it yesterday. They've eaten it every day for the last 3 months. Why are they not eating it today? And it's really normal for kids to jag. And you've lost that then. So one way of getting around that is constantly trying to rotate, even if it's a small number of foods from each food group, what they're having. Okay, cool. So we'll have Weetabix this morning, and we'll have toast the next morning, and we'll have pancake the next morning, and then we'll go back to Weetabix, but maybe we'll offer it as supper before bed, so it's a different time of day, because otherwise you can risk losing those foods, often in the short term, but for more complex children you can lose them completely. And we all do it, don't we? Do you know, I not long back from Italy, and I genuinely, no word of a lie, ate pasta every single day. I mean, when in Rome, literally. So I ate every day, and I got back, and I probably didn't have pasta for 3 weeks. I was like, I didn't have pasta. I don't really fancy pasta. It's not because I don't like pasta. It's because I've had quite a lot of that, and I don't want it anymore. Yeah.
There's a really good Scottish word for that. It's called being scunnered by something.
I don't know.
Yeah. I just always have to get that in. No one can ever understand what I'm talking about, but you scunner yourself, so you scunnered yourself with pasta.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. I'll say that if I see any Scottish family.
You should
pronounce it right and get it right. So
we've got one more question from one of the members that we haven't quite covered yet. And that is, what is the best way to introduce new foods to children? Or how do you get children to try new things?
Okay, I have lots of... Do you know what? This falls into... Everybody laughs at me. I have multiple E's for fussy eating that kind of fall into... They all seem to start with E. So I was like, I'm just going to write this down like this. How do you get your children to eat food that they don't eat already? First things first, you need to expose them to it. And this goes back to, I'll just give my children the food that they know that they eat. So you expose them to it, but I would always say start with the exposure and do not expect them to eat it. Remember that exposure to food, a little bit like if you're given a food on holiday that you have never heard or seen before, you do not ram it straight in your mouth. No. You look at it and you go, oh, it's this colour, it's this shape, whatever, and you might touch it and you might smell it and you might decide, if all of those things feel okay, that you might try just a little bit of it. Again, you tend not to go for a massive mouthful, do you? Just in case you don't like it. So expose your child to foods regularly, but take the pressure off eating. So, and I would, as big advocate of family meals, try and expose it at a family meal. Oh, sorry, my alarm bell. So try and expose it at a family meal where other people are eating that food, because eating together and role modelling is so I cannot tell you how important this is. And I know it is difficult, but even if it is one other person eating with that child, a sibling, a friend, one parent, even if you have to have a little bit of a smaller meal before you sit down and eat with your partner later on in the evening, they will eventually want to do what you are doing. So you do need to lead by example, and you do need to role model for them, and lots of evidence shows us how important that is. And even family style serving can help, and what I mean by that is, say, I'm going back to my fish fingers, mashed potato and peas, don't know why that's in my head today. If you put it all into the middle of the table and help the child serve it to their own plate, or at least interact with it at that stage. They don't have to eat it, there's no pressure to eat it, but they might pick one pea, but that's fine. I was, and the thing about exposure is that there is, again, lots of evidence that will say it might be in excess of 10 or 15 exposures to a food before they finally get round to interacting with it, smelling it, touching it. And they might put it in their mouth and spit it straight back out again and say they don't like it. That's fine. That is absolutely fine. So there's a lot about exposure. I would say make sure that your expectations are very clear. So it does help children to have a clear routine about eating. So 3 meals, 2 or 3 snack times a day. Some families find that for some children a little cue to eating. So we wash our hands before we eat, or we lay out the placemats, or kind of like, it's time to eat now sort of trigger can be helpful. And I think the thing about keeping a routine clear for families is that it's quite helpful, even if a meal is fully refused. Your child, unless it's the last meal of the day, is probably going to have the option to eat again in 2 or 3 hours time. So they haven't eaten anything for breakfast, but you know what, at 10 o'clock we're going to offer them snacks, so let's crack on with the day. Let's not sit here for hours and hours and hours, because that is so fruitless usually. I've got families that sit for hours. It's usually fruitless. I'd say expectation, meal time is 20 to 30 minutes and we're done and on to the next thing. And that's managing parents' expectations around that as well. It's probably always important to exclude other factors that might affect your child's appetite. So sort of my more medical hat goes on now, and things like constipation or iron deficiency anemia can be right buggers if you're trying to get a child to eat, to be completely honest. So if you do have any concerns about either of those things, it's worth seeing the GP. And my next E, look at me, it sounds like I know all these off the top of my head, I say them many times a week, is usually around emotion. So, but that's your emotion and their emotion. So you really do need to ease off the pressure. You need to ease off the pressure off yourself, but you need to ease the pressure off the child. The child does not tend to eat well when they're being force-fed, when they're under pressure, when they're constantly being cajoled. Just one more bite. Just have it. Mummy's eating it, why aren't you eating it? The dog's eating it, why aren't you eating it? Well, you just take one bite. They just sit there. And actually, I would say to families, if somebody was sitting there doing that to you with a food that you disliked, mine would say be mushrooms, I would just be like, would you just shut up? I don't feel like eating anything now. So relaxed, particularly in younger children, you might have to over-exaggerate some of your emotions that this is really delicious. But I do tend to say also steer away from those describing foods with emotion. Oh, Mum thinks it's really yummy and it's tasty, and isn't this, delicious? I just did it then. That's how easy it is to fall back in the trap, to be honest. But actually, just with children describing food how it is. So today we've got peas. Peas are round. Oh, and if I put them in my finger, they go pop. Do you know what I mean? So you're teaching the way that child learns. So you're going colour, shape, texture, smell, letting them sort of explore it from that point of view and try and keep the pressure off. It is really hard. I am saying this so flippantly. Oh yeah, just don't be stressed. Well, you are stressed. Go scream in a pillow in another room. Just for that 20 minutes, you just need to hold it together. And yes, you might not do that every day at every meal, but as best as possible. Because the other thing is, especially with young children and that fussy eating age, is that their language comprehension is probably not there, and their understanding of the world and other people's emotions is probably by reading body language largely, and behaviour of other people. Now, if you're anxious, they're anxious. And if they're anxious, it's so infectious. If they're anxious, they are not going to eat, because then fight or flight stress response kicks in anyway, which massively dampens appetite. So, game face all of the time, as best as possible. Definitely expect that every day will be different. Children's appetites fluctuate wildly. And you'll know this, Rachel. One day you're like, where are you putting it all? Where? Where's it all going? Are you going to stop? And then the next day, they literally turn their nose up at everything that you offer them. And again, that's quite normal. That might have been a very busy day of learning about something else, and they're just not ready for the sensory task of eating today. And actually, I had lots of energy yesterday because I ate quite a lot of food. So those day-to-day fluctuations are really normal. They're normal because children get ill. They're normal because growth requirements change. I see lots of families who struggle with the jump between 1 and 2 because after 1, children's growth, the requirements and the energy required to grow really slow down. So they need less food. And so sometimes it can feel like your 2-year-old is eating less than your 1-year-old did. And again, that's quite normal. So it's kind of allowing them to eat to appetite. They're very good at appetite regulation. And we lose that somewhere along the way, don't we? We lose Lucy's full, but she still wants the crumble.
Yep.
We lose that. But children are very, very good at that. What else? Try and avoid any excess fluids, especially milk. That could be a naughty one. Lots of toddlers I see are consuming lots and lots and lots of milk or fluids, and that's going to be getting in the way of their appetite, or lots of those excess preferred foods. I just want them to eat, so I've given them 4 slices of toast. You know what? You can give them toast, but perhaps let's give them 1 so that there's a chance they'll still have an appetite at lunchtime.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. And then really, really try hard to avoid any exacerbating behaviours, so force feeding, just offering those preferred foods at family meals, offering too much. And often I see families giving kids too many options, and they're like, whoa, hold on a minute, there's 6 different things on my plate. I'm just going to pick this one because this feels the easiest thing to eat. And you mentioned it earlier, no earning potential. Food does not have earning potential. If you eat this, you can have your pudding. I really cannot stress enough, no food should have an earning potential for anybody. It's just food. Yeah. Lots of people now, dietitians and nutritionists who work with kids will often say, put what would be typical sort of inverted commas pudding foods just alongside the main meal. We've got yogurt and we've got blueberries and we've got a bit of chocolate, but we've also got our rice and our curry and our salad or whatever it might be, and it's all there, and food is just food. You don't want children placing higher value on certain foods because it can have quite detrimental effects, long term, really. And looking at the other things that might make your mealtime a little bit more challenging. So it could be really normal. I get them to eat if I put the iPad and Peppa Pig on. And some people really do resort to that, and if you're there, that's okay, that's fine, but I tend to try and say we need to pull back on the entertainment at meal times because you're diverting away from the actual process of eating and learning. Because if their eyes are on Peppa Pig, they're not on what everybody else is eating, or the skills that they need to learn, or socialising, or talking, and all those other really important things that can happen in that finite 20-minute window. They're actually such a wonderful experience of learning potential at a meal time, and that's hard if I'm picking on Peppa Pig now, aren't I? It's Peppa Pig.
Yep.
Peppa. Yeah, I'm picking on Peppa. Is at the mealtime. So, if you find that it's there at the moment, if you've got parents who are listening to this and saying, oh, that's me, that's fine. Start to try and reduce the time. So have it on and then take it away gradually. Move it away until it's finally gone. Again, a complete cull, particularly in a toddler who won't understand when you try and explain why you've changed their routine, is probably going to lead to a tantrum. Yeah. So we start to do it, slowly. And then lots of other engaging in other food-related behaviours. Messy play, no pressure on eating. Cooking, you don't have to eat it. Shopping, I've got kids who love watching cooking shows. I mean, I had a 5-year-old the other day who told me he was watching Saturday Kitchen, which I loved. I was like, brilliant. But anything that exposes, that makes food normal, that makes food not scary, will be beneficial. But it's just to say that health professionals do know that it's hard work. And whilst, we might say, isn't it great your child's growing really well, and actually they're having foods from lots of different food groups, we're not empathising with the fact that it's not difficult. But you definitely can get there. Just kind of trust the process, even though sometimes it feels really counterintuitive because your child is not having big meals, or they're refusing foods, or they've skipped a whole meal. So
Oh, that's some great advice. It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
If anyone who's listening wants to find out more about what you do, or have a little look on Instagram, where's the best place to go? Would it be Instagram or?
It's probably Instagram, at Children's Dietitian.
Great. I will put a link to that in the show notes. So if you're listening on your phone just now, you can just scroll down and there should be some links and things to click there and you can go straight through.
Lovely.
But thank you again so much for
your
your
time.
time.
You're so welcome.
So
it's been a pleasure. You can probably gather I can just talk about this forever.
Oh, absolutely. I find it really interesting. It's been lovely to listen. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks again, Lucy, for joining us for this episode of the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to that. I hope any parents out there that have been struggling with health eating in your family or even some fussy eating behaviours from your kids, I hope you've taken something away from that and I hope you've enjoyed listening. If you have enjoyed listening, please scroll down on Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. And also, if you know anyone who might want to listen to this episode or indeed any of our other episodes, then please do share the link with your friends or just tell them to Google the Ditch the Diet podcast. So thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week, next Thursday again, for the final instalment of our macronutrient myth-busting episodes with the truth about fat. So I will see you again next Thursday for another episode of the Ditch the Diet podcast.